Thanks for attending. For those of you who haven't heard me speak before, here's a little background. I started studying Nina Gabrilowitsch after my lifelong friend Rudy Bowling inherited Nina's 1924 diary, which she kept when she was 13 years old. My friends and I read the diary, and we were charmed by Nina's literate descriptions of her affluent life in 1920s Detroit. Only afterward did we learn that Nina was a person of any note, that, in fact, her grandfather had been Mark Twain. One of my ongoing objectives in writing and speaking about Nina is to portray her in a positive light because the end of her story was so bleak. I want to show Nina to the world in ways that are not depressing, negative, or downbeat. So, naturally, I'm going with the topic of mental illness this time. But it's something I've been wondering for years. Was there a genetic factor to Nina's mental deterioration? I've had that question ever since I first learned that Nina's mother and grandmother both suffered from nervous prostration, whatever that is. Since this question involved the medical history of the Clemens family, there was one person in particular that I wanted to consult, Dr. Patrick Ober. I was composing an email to Patrick Ober when I learned that he passed away suddenly last year. I did not know Dr. Ober well, but when I delivered my very first presentation on Nina at the Clemens Conference in 2019, he was the other speaker on our two-person panel. And let me tell you, he was a great opening act. Since then, I've always felt a sort of foxhole camaraderie for him. On the occasions afterward, when we met, he was casual, friendly, and funny. Since I last spoke to the Twain scholarship community, my friend Rudy Bowling also passed away in December 2024. It was Rudy who inherited the 1924 diary and first set me on the trail of Nina Gabrilowitsch. Rudy was always supportive of my research into her life and always interested in the latest discoveries. I'd like to dedicate this presentation to both Rudy's memory and that of Patrick Ober. Anyone who studies Mark Twain's life knows that his wife, Livy, had a fragile constitution. She was often bedridden with a variety of problems, including nervous prostration. So before we go any further, let's answer the question, just what the heck is nervous prostration anyway? I started with Patrick Ober's great book, Mark Twain and Medicine. It includes 2 whole chapters on the mystery ailment, nervous prostration. This was also known as nervous exhaustion, neurasthenia, neuralgia, nerve weakness, and Americanitis. That last one is because it was thought to afflict Gilded Age Americans more acutely than anyone else. This is presumably due to their go-getter attitudes and/or the rapidly advancing technologies of the industrial age. In 1903, the pharmaceutical company Rexall produced an Americanitis elixir. This was a close relative of the snake oils that both Patrick Ober and Mark Twain loved to write about. Their love for the crazy patent medicines of the 19th century seems similar to my own love for the bad B movies of the 20th century. According to Smithsonian writer Greg Dougherty, quote, among other ingredients, Americanitis elixir contained 15% alcohol and a little chloroform. End quote. Oops. I wish I could have consulted with Patrick Ober on this topic. Since that was not possible, I reached out to Elizabeth Moon, a licensed clinical therapist, for a modern medical perspective on nervous prostration. She suggests it would be diagnosed today as a wide variety of possible conditions, including anxiety disorder, depression, and panic attacks. I had to look up some of the other possible conditions like dysautonomia and somatic symptom disorder. Better-known maladies such as PTSD, attention deficit, OCD, and even complications of autism may have also fallen under the Americanitis umbrella. Perhaps the most well-known victim of nervous prostration was the poet Emily Dickinson. Writing in the Emily Dickinson Journal, Dr. John F. McDermott reports, quote, nervous prostration included many symptoms such as profound exhaustion, insomnia, pressure and heaviness in the head, palpitation of the heart, trembling of the muscles, as well as multiple fears, end quote. Frail and bedridden, Dickinson might well have found a kindred spirit in Livy Clemens if they'd ever met, but victims of nervous prostration were often prescribed the rest cure, which prohibited them from socializing. McDermott goes on, quote, neurasthenia was considered a physical ailment due to the actual loss of strength by the nervous system. The The nerves were believed to have a natural electrical charge of energy which could run down, just like a battery, from overexertion, end quote. You can't talk about nervous prostration in literature without mentioning Charlotte Perkins Gilman and her 1892 story, The Yellow Wallpaper. I feel a little silly recommending this short story to a room full of literature professors. But if by chance you haven't read it, The Yellow Wallpaper is an unforgettable portrait of an unraveling mind. Even Stephen King said it terrified him. The Yellow Wallpaper is less about the experience of nervous prostration and more an indictment of the rest cure. This treatment was famously experienced by Livy Langdon Clemens in her teen years and in later life. It involved long periods of isolated bed rest for 6 weeks to a year, only moderate exercise, no reading, writing, or art of any kind, including sewing or craft work, and occasional visits by a doctor or nurse, but no socializing with friends or family members, including spouses. Therapist Elizabeth Moon describes the rest cure as, quote, a well-intentioned, psychologically incomplete intervention that likely worsened depression. It was an attempt to treat genuine nervous system overwhelm, but it relied on an outdated understanding of mental health, and often removed precisely the factors that we now know are essential for recovery, including agency, meaningful activity, and gradual re-engagement with life, end quote. Discussing her famous story in 1913, Charlotte Perkins Gilman revealed her own experience with the rest cure. After 3 months of it, Gilman reported that she, quote, came so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that I could see over, end quote. Gilman abandoned the rest cure and later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper as part therapy, part cautionary tale, and part activist literature. Patrick Ober reports that even Mark Twain tried the rest cure briefly in 1881. Not surprisingly, Twain's personality was ill-suited for enforced inactivity and isolation. Looking at Livy's medical history, I quickly became lost in her bewildering array of physical ailments. In Mark Twain and the Company of Women, Laura Scandera-Tromley says, quote, her documented illnesses range from frequent colds and tonsillitis to life-threatening influenza, typhoid, diphtheria, asthma, syncope or fainting spells, heart attacks, and hyperthyroid disease, end quote. Scandera-Tromley discusses Livy's teen years as an invalid, which lasted over 4 years, not the 2 years Mark Twain reported. Scandera-Tromley suspects her incapacity was caused by Pott's disease, a form of tuberculosis that attacks the spine. I didn't even know tuberculosis could infect the bones. Livy's complicated medical history makes it difficult to address my question of a hereditary element. Say, for example, that Livy's neurasthenia was what we would call depression today. Was that depression caused by genetic elements or by her chronic health problems and dicey treatment methods? In later life, Livy was often prescribed the rest cure for various complaints, including heart disease. She was allowed only brief contact with her husband for weeks at a time. Both Twain and Livy found this distressing, but doctors believed that Twain's fiery, provocative personality would be worse for her delicate constitution. This brings us to resilience, one of the themes of this year's conference. Again and again, with the support of her family, Livy rallied through serious health crises and sometimes misguided attempts at treatment. Clara Clemens also suffered from nervous attacks periodically. In the absence of a comprehensive biography of Clara, I turned to the newest addition to my Nina bookshelf, Ron Chernow's recent best-selling biography of Mark Twain. I can't wait for the musical. I make it a point to collect any book that talks about Nina, no matter how briefly. Chernow's massive book includes one paragraph about Nina Gabrilowitsch on page 1031. That might not sound like a lot, but in studying Nina, I would say it's actually about typical. You could call it the Nina ratio. In works of Mark Twain scholarship, you'll find one paragraph about Nina for every 1,000 pages about Mark Twain. Anyway, Ron Chernow writes, quote, was there ever a family so cursed and badgered by illness as the Clemenses, end quote. I probably don't need to tell this crowd about the family's tragic history of medical crises. Chernow lists 3 separate occasions when Clara was bedridden with the rest cure, all of them precipitated by major emotional shocks. After Livy's death in 1904, Clara spent more than a year in isolation. Like Livy, she was forbidden to have contact with Mark Twain for much of that time. Nina's 1924 diary chronicles the Gabrilowitsch family's summer travels in Europe. In August 1924, Nina mentions hearing loud screams from her mother's room. A few weeks later, the family spends 10 days at the Grunewald Sanitarium, a health resort and clinic in Berlin. I have to wonder if this was for Clara's benefit. Nina doesn't say. There's one more incident involving Clara that I want to discuss. Now we're back to 1904 when the Clemens family was living in Italy. The family's medical and financial crises increased the pressure on Clara. In February 1904, the pressures finally became too much. As Thomas Larson revealed in a 2003 article for the San Diego Reader, Clara snapped. In a letter, Clara described the incident herself. Quote, "I was seized by something and began to scream and curse and knock down the furniture, till everyone, of course, came running, and in my father's presence I said I hated him, hated my mother, hoped they would all die, and if they didn't succeed soon, I would kill them. And well, on for more than an hour. I don't know all I said, but mother, hearing the noise and being told I was overwrought, got a heart attack." End quote. Thomas Larson goes so far as to suggest this outburst contributed to Livy's final decline and death 4 months later. Larson and Chernow are both puzzled by this event, and so is Clara. In the letter I mentioned, she had no explanation for her behavior. Maybe it's because I've just been reading it, but the language in Clara's letter sounds hauntingly like the narrator in the yellow wallpaper. It seems clear that this was no mere temper tantrum, but a full-on psychological breakdown of some kind. Most of Clara's bouts of nervous prostration that I could document happened after this event. It's also worth noting that Clara was 29, roughly the age when Nina's mental illness began to seriously interfere with her life, and that neither of Clara's sisters lived into their 30s. If the general public knows anything at all about Nina, they usually know that she suffered from alcoholism or mental illness. But when Rudy Bowling, Jerry Smith, and I first read Nina's teen diary in 1992, we knew nothing about that aspect of Nina's life. In fact, for a rich kid, she seemed very ordinary. We were charmed by her descriptions of quintessential teen experiences. We were not that far from teens ourselves then, and we remembered what teenagers are like, especially teen girls. Nina described things like playing pranks, crushes on teachers, and getting the giggles.
Monday, January 15. I went to my music lesson, and I know Mr. Morse could have gladly slapped me. He got so cross because my fingering was not right, and he thought he was making a great impression when he screamed at me. But I had a giggling fit, and I simply couldn't stop, with those green cat-like eyes of his staring at me. The more he explained and got excited, the more I laughed. Mademoiselle sat there shaking her small head, but it only amused me the more. When we got out on the street, I laughed so hard that I could hardly stand up, especially as my portfolio contained school books besides the music. Mademoiselle said, "Quelquefois, je doute de votre bon sens," which means sometimes I doubt whether you are in your right mind.
In May 1924, Nina writes effusively about her crush on her beloved music teacher, Martha Wiest. This sort of crush is actually typical for kids this age who are raised in a gender-segregated environment like a girls' school. In any case, it didn't seem like unusual behavior for a girl Nina's age. On March 5th, 1924, Nina describes how she and her friend Harriet Hughes spent their afternoon. They played in the alley behind Harriet's house for a while, then collected milk bottles, cans, and pails. They climbed onto the sloping roof of Harriet's garage. Quote, "We filled the aforesaid articles with water, we poured water on the people that passed on the street. I deluged one lady with a can, and she turned and walked toward the garage. We were frightened stiff, and as I ran down the ladder, I fell and was covered with mud. We certainly had fun." End quote. In the diary, these bouts of mischief just seem like classic, even iconic examples of American childhood, like a scene from Tom Sawyer. In 2014, Susan Bailey and Deborah Gosselin published their book about Nina, The Twain Shall Meet. When they wrote the book, they had access to Nina's diaries from later life. I read these chapters eagerly, as I had never been able to make the trip to Utah to examine Nina's later diaries myself. but what I found surprised and perplexed me. Discussing the 1925 diary, only a year after the happy-go-lucky days of the 24 diary, author Deb Gosselin characterizes Nina's behavior as erratic. Nina was having trouble concentrating in school and getting uncontrollable attacks of the giggles more often. Gosselin ventured that rather than charming childhood frivolity, it sounded like the symptoms of attention deficit disorder. Nina's crush on teacher Martha Wiest also remained, but now that Wiest knew all about it, Nina was starting to get obnoxious. Then, just before summer vacation, Nina and Harriet got busted climbing around on roofs when their families couldn't locate them. They were forbidden from doing it again, which sounds like a typical teenage experience. But it struck me as odd that the very activities we read about with such humor seemed to have become a cycle she couldn't get out of. Many Twain scholars are familiar with Susan Bailey, who wrote the definitive book on Nina, The Twain Shall Meet. She is one of the world's few experts on Nina Gabrilowitsch. I jokingly refer to this very small fraternity of Nina scholars as Ninologists. I asked Susan Bailey for her opinion of Nina's mental illness. Susan does not believe that there was a genetic or physical cause for Nina's decline. She believes Nina's condition was caused by traumatic experiences in childhood, specifically by the long periods of time that Nina spent without her parents in the care of nurses and nannies. Okay, so I wanted to consider all the possible factors, so let's look at this one too. I'm glad she brought it up. I'd also wondered about this. It's true that in the 1924 diary, Nina's parents are conspicuous by their absence. Whole weeks pass with one or both parents gone, traveling to keep up with their busy musical careers. As the diary begins, Nina introduces herself and her nanny, Mademoiselle. But her parents don't even show up until a week into the year. On January 7th, Ossip and Clara make their dramatic entrance.
Monday, January 7. Father arrived at the house at 10 minutes to 9. The minute he put his nose in the house, he said it was too hot, and I had to turn off every radiator he laid his eyes on. It is really funny. Mother and father left the 28th of December at different stations, but at the same time. They arrived this morning at different stations and almost at the same time.
In 1963, Dr. Hugh Missildine wrote about, quote, the effect of neglect on children of materially successful, privileged families. Unhappy, maladjusted, often involved in delinquent behavior, these children had little or no contact with their parents, end quote. It's certainly possible that this or some other past trauma caused Nina's mental illness. However, this opinion was not shared by Bailey's former co-author, Deb Gosselin, one of the other Ninologists. Writing in The Twain Shall Meet, Gosselin suggested that Nina was bipolar. Bipolar disorder is characterized by unpredictable and extreme mood swings. People with bipolar disorder can experience crippling depression, followed by periods of energetic, sleepless behavior known as mania. A manic episode is consistent with Nina's actions in November 1965, just 2 months before her death. She abruptly called the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner and urgently demanded to speak to a reporter. At an impromptu press conference after midnight in a hotel room, she claimed that she was practically destitute. Chain-smoking, Nina spoke enthusiastically to reporters for some time. She referred to Samuel Clemens as grandfather and gushed about actor Hal Holbrook's stage performance as Twain. In short, she was behaving erratically, but seemed upbeat. A month later, according to Bailey and Gosselin's The Twain Shall Meet, Nina had an unspecified violent episode. She was sent by her doctor to St. Vincent Hospital in Los Angeles, but went AWOL on January 13, 1966. 3 days later, she was dead. If Nina shared a hereditary mental illness with her mother and grandmother, why did it crush her when they survived? Maybe because even in their worst moments, Clara and Livy still had the support of their family. By 1966, that was no longer the case. Even Clara, the immortal survivor of the Clemens family, was gone. I'm not qualified to diagnose Nina's condition, so I felt it would be more appropriate to collect and present what information I could. Much of Nina's life is a mystery, but with more research, I think we could actually figure out what happened to the Clemens women who survived into middle age. Are there any mysteries we can solve in the meantime? What about Nina's behavior in the 1924 diary that is so curiously repeated in later diaries? Were we mistaken seeing her behavior as innocent, ordinary childhood antics? Or were Bailey and Gosselin wrong in seeing this behavior as early signs of mental disturbance? the idea occurs to me that we might both be correct. I believe that the 1924 diary was emotionally significant to Nina. That's why she held on to it until the end of her life after she gave the rest of her diaries away. As I learned more about her later life, it seemed like the 1924 Nina was the true Nina, before she was stolen away by alcohol and mental illness. Maybe Nina believed that too. Maybe she reread the 1924 diary to remember the person she had been before. I know from the experiences of keeping my own teenage journals that a diary can become a sort of echo chamber. Rereading your own words often enough can reinforce certain ideas about yourself, positive or negative. Maybe Nina was consciously or unconsciously repeating behavior from the 1924 diary, believing that if giggling fits or unrequited crushes had been endearing at 13, they would continue to appeal long past an age when such behavior was considered appropriate. I admit that's all speculation, but I can't help asking what-if questions about Nina Gabrilowitsch. Past generations of scholars accepted her tragic fate as a foregone conclusion, but these days we know better. Bipolar syndrome is very treatable with medication, and so are a host of other mental disorders. Treatment for substance abuse made huge advances in the years after Nina's early death. I can't help wanting more from the woman who wrote words like these as a little girl.
Sunday, January 20. It is a beautiful morning. The sun is just streaming into my sitting room and making very cheerful and bright. The snow is very deep and glistens and sparkles in the sun. In the afternoon, we went to the concert. It was lovely. Mr. Abbas and Madame Ostrovska played the violoncello and the harp together. We walked home. It was twilight. The houses were lighted up, the snow was bright and crisp, and the full moon shone golden in the sky.